do a mic check?
Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I haven't been in front of a microphone in a long time. So you look younger. I have less hair and more wrinkles. And I'm the guy that's retired.
I don't feel younger, let me tell you. You guys are picking me up okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay.
You ready to get fact?
Don't say that too fast.
Don't answer. So Taylor Owen has been trolling this misinformation and disinformation space since he was among the first to spot it as a real threat to democracies. Along with a few other pioneers, he has rallied academics, podcasters, the political class to see information warfare for what it truly is. It's an attempt to take genuinely curious minds, marry them with doubt and sometimes conspiracy, and thereby dilute the belief that facts even exist. That there are things that are verifiably correct. And man, has he been busy at that. This guy has written multiple books. He's taught and studied at UBC, Columbia, Oxford, and now at McGill University, where he founded the Center for Media Technology and Democracy. He's also a fellow podcaster, currently the host of the Globe and Mail's Machines Like Us podcast. And Taylor, I always get teased when I run down my similar resume, lots of places, lots of things I've done, but people think I can't keep a job.
Yeah,
do you ever get that?
No question. All the time.
So let's zero in on this inaugural podcast on the Canadian election campaign that's underway. And we'll get into some of the specifics on that. But first,
Sure.
If you could help us understand what you and some of the students at the Maxwell School of Public Policy do to track misinformation and disinformation at a time like this.
Yeah, absolutely. So one, thanks for having me on. It's great to chat again.
Good to see you again.
We've been talking about this for years, and it's nice to it takes
doing
an
it.
election to bring us back together. Yeah. So we run something called the Media Ecosystem Observatory, which for going back 3 elections now, and in the time in between as well, times in between them as well, we try, and it's a team of not just students, but of 20 or so engineers and academics and journalists who we try and capture as much of the public information flowing through Canadian democracy as possible. So this is all the journalism, certainly, but also as much of the public posts of media figures, politicians, influencers, citizens, flowing through the social media ecosystem. And we pair that with regular surveys to see if what's flowing through the ecosystem is changing people's behavior or opinions on things. And this method, which we've been working on again for 3 elections through COVID, has really allowed us to get a pretty comprehensive picture of what a healthy and unhealthy information ecosystem looks like as a whole in Canada. And in an election, this capacity to do that takes on sort of a slightly different importance and urgency, because in elections, as you know better than anybody, the reliability of information is at a premium, right? We need to all collectively have access to some degree of reliable information in order to make democratic decisions together as a society. And again, as you know, I mean, increasingly that's harder and harder to do.
You know, that piece about changing behavior, that's the holy grail, trying to figure that piece out, because ultimately they are trying to impact our attention and some of the deficit of information that exists. As you say, you've been looking at this for 3 elections now.
Yeah.
Big picture, has it influenced our behavior?
Without question. Yeah. I mean, it has in elections, but it's also in between elections. I mean, during COVID might be the clearest case of this, where because we could see the whole Canadian ecosystem, we could see the anti-vax content and the false content, the conspiracy theories and the misinformation around vaccines coming into our ecosystem from the US. The majority of it did, interestingly. The majority of the anti-vax content in Canada came in from America because we're so connected to their ecosystem. And we saw that if you were consuming that information, you were less likely to follow Canadian public health guidance around vaccines. So that was a very clear correlation. In elections, it's a little trickier because people vote for all sorts of reasons. And it's very difficult to pin down exactly why someone might have changed their vote. Was it a single piece of information they saw? Was it an act of a foreign government trying to influence their? It's very difficult to get at that. But in an overarching way, what we're very clearly seeing is a degradation of the quality of information in our ecosystem. It is harder and harder to find and identify the signals or the filters of reliability because of the way we've constructed this ecosystem. And that might not have an individual behavioral effect on any one topic, but I think it does play a role in like lowering the quality of our discourse, of making people less trusting of each other, of increasing polarization in our society, dividing us against each other, creating more toxicity in our discourse. And all of those things are bad at all times, but particularly during an election.
You know, the last time we did this, it was about the 2019 election. And I know that you tracked some of that degradation in discourse as far as it pertains to mainstream media and whether or not, I mean, people obviously aren't turning to it the same way, but how quickly is that changing?
Yeah, I mean, this is a remarkable shift in the ecosystem. I mean, one of the hard things about this work is that the information ecosystem is changing constantly. It is different today than it was yesterday. The technologies change, the platforms change, the algorithms change, the way we use them change, right? It's all evolving. And one of the main differences we see now compared to 2019 is in 2019, we were very concerned about what happened in the US in 2016 in the Trump election happening in Canada. So we scaled up this whole initiative and everyone was very concerned about these problems. And there actually wasn't a huge impact of foreign interference or disinformation in that election that we saw. And one of the report we did about that election was called Lessons in Resilience. And one of the key pieces of resilience that we identified was that Canadians had a much higher trust in journalism than the Americans and a much higher consumption rate of traditional journalism across all points in the ideological spectrum. So even from the far right to the far left, 70 to 80%, depending on where you were on that spectrum, people consumed one of the 5 main journalism networks and trusted them.
So there was that anchor on the ecosystem at that time.
Exactly. And it anchors a good way to put it, in that if you go out onto the internet and you see something crazy, you see a piece of false information, you see a conspiracy theory, but then you watch the evening news and it disproves it, it provides an anchor of reality. And the US didn't have that in 2016. They had already seen the plummeting in trust in journalism happen. Since 2019, we've seen a very precipitous drop in both the trust in journalism and the consumption of journalism. And there's lots of reasons for both of those, I think, but I think it's a real warning sign here that we don't have that ballast anymore in our ecosystem.
When you talk about consumption of journalism, I mean, the obvious thing that comes to my mind is Meta's Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, their block on Canadian news. Has it had much of an impact on how much Canadian news is consumed by Canadians?
Oh yeah, it's radical. It's when you talk about these exogenous effects that platforms can have on your ecosystem, and one of them is they decide what we see and what we don't see. And when Meta blocked news about a year and a half ago, because we're capturing the ecosystem largely, we could see the effect it had. And the immediate effect was a loss of 11 million views of journalism a day in Canada. So 11 million times that a Canadian citizen would have come across a piece of reliable information in their feeds went away in one day. And that's gone. That never came back. It didn't get replaced by other platforms. It just was taken out of there was no substitution effect. It just disappeared from Canadian democracy, ultimately. And what's crazy is that if you ask Canadians who say they get their news on Meta products on Facebook and Instagram, they still say they do. The majority of people who say they got their news off those two platforms still say they do.
Now, is that because, I mean, I saw this the other day, a big thing on Facebook that looked like it was CBC News. I mean, they even captured the promotions for CTV
Yeah.
News in the margins,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it wasn't. It was selling a cryptocurrency scam. Is that what is? Are people seeing that and they think that's news?
That is a problem, and we're seeing that too, and we're actually studying that this election, that very site. I don't think that's what's going on in this case, though. In this case, I think there's two things going on. One is that people have found some ways to circumvent the block of Facebook, which is to post screenshots of news, which interestingly is like literal theft of news. Right?
Okay, I do that. I'll admit that.
Right.
Just so I can share it. It's the only way you can share it.
You are literally breaking the copyright of the news outlets and probably making it so that Meta is now subject to C18 again, which is what they were trying to avoid by not showing news.
All right, I'm part of the problem, obviously.
So part of the problem clearly on that. The bigger thing, that's probably a marginal effect. The bigger thing is that I don't think people equate news with journalism anymore. So when you say you're getting news, you're including influencers, friends and family, random stranger who's showed up in your feed, right? If it's talking about information about the world or politics or events, you're probably considering that news rather than equating news with journalism, which is a pretty big problem for journalism.
So it's like Xerox losing their brand, right? It just becomes ubiquitous. News is just information that I see, not anything that's verified.
Absolutely, yeah. News is information about the world that pops into my view, not something that was created through a process to determine the reliability of that information, to filter for reliability, and to disseminate it in a responsible way.
Well, so that's the environment, and it sounds like a very different environment than even 4 years ago. You know, adding in, of course, automation, which we'll talk about in a second. But tell me, are you spotting attempts in this campaign so far to take advantage of that ecosystem? That it's better to buy ads that look like news than it is to actually find real news, at least on the Meta products let's talk about?
It's interesting because some of the access to Facebook ads that we used to get access to through the archive is much harder to derive now. They've really sort of turned down a lot of the data access on Meta products right at the time when we need them most, I would add. But that's just a general shift in Silicon Valley towards providing access to researchers. So it's been a little tricky to see ads. We are seeing some signs of manipulation or inauthentic behavior. It's pretty early though, and we're pretty careful to not flag things until we really know they're a problem. There's a lot of increased bot activity, for example, a ton of automated accounts that look to be behaving in a coordinated way. We're seeing a number of Facebook groups that are being renamed as 51st State groups. So they're old groups that have been dormant for a while that happen to have big user bases, right? Because it's hard to build a group from scratch, but you can acquire a group and then rename it and reuse it for a new purpose.
Because the followers are still there, and that way they have an instant magnification.
Exactly. And so we haven't seen it being used yet, but we see the infrastructure there to potentially be used. So we're seeing signs of some things, but honestly, there's a whole part of the problem, as you'll remember from these previous elections, is that there's a real risk during an election of journalism in particular flagging every bad thing they see on the internet and amplifying it to their audiences as an example of disinformation campaigns.
Right.
And that ends up ultimately trivializing the actual impact of an actual disinformation campaign. And so we do a baseline study where we take tips from the public, and we've gotten hundreds of those already through the election. We investigate them through the system, through the data collection model. And if we see them rising to a high level of degree of severity or reach or impact, then we kind of raise the flag and raise the awareness on them.
What about X? Because again, there was some anticipation that Elon Musk would put his thumb on his ability to do that with the algorithms and elevate the 51st State conversation, which he has already stated he agrees with, that Canada's border isn't real.
Yeah.
And also he, earlier anyway, expressed support for Poilievre. Have we seen an increase in, first of all, I guess, X activity around, I assume we would around the Canadian election, that's natural, but have we seen any evidence that something is being artificially powered?
Yeah, it's interesting. In the lead up to the election, we did see a real increase on X in conservative content. A 50% increase in conservative content in the time since Musk took over X. That's totally separate from the amount of people posting. So there was clearly an algorithmic shift in Canada that affected the ratio of ideological content in Canada. That was something we've been really concerned about when we're watching it, but we don't know yet, honestly. That's going to take a bit of time to figure out whether that overall character has changed. What we haven't seen yet, which is interesting, is him engaging in the Canadian discourse. And I think a lot of people were concerned that he would do something similar as he did in the UK and Germany in the last 6 months, where he very actively engaged in the politics of the country, spreading a ton of false information as well in both cases. And I'm curious what you think, why that hasn't happened yet. I mean, one theory is that it didn't work in the UK and Germany. The AFD lost despite his backing them, and in part, it looks like they did worse because he was publicly backing them. And in Germany and in the UK, there was a big backlash against his participation in the political debate there.
Yeah, and then
so it might be he's chastened. It's possible. The other option, though, which who knows, but it's not impossible that him and Trump have decided that their engagement in Canada is not going to help an outcome they want.
That suggests a pretty strategic mind there. And
it does, but Trump's been changing his rhetoric around the 51st state in the last 2 weeks, and it's pretty clear that message could have gotten through, right? That he wasn't helping his cause in Canada by further aggravating during the election. So who knows? And it may still happen, and we're watching for it very closely.
But as you watch for it, you bring up a really interesting point, and you're saying it's going to take a lot more work to know whether or not there has been some artificial elevation or manipulation of the algorithm. Can you figure that out? I mean, is this part of the calculation transparent at all? Like, how are you going to prove whether or not there's been some attempt to influence the Canadian election campaign on Twitter from outside of the country?
It's very hard because they've made their systems very opaque. And this is why regulation is needed to require some degree of transparency over how their systems work. Unfortunately, we didn't pass the bill, C-63, the Online Harms Act, which would have mandated that transparency. It died on the order paper when Trudeau prorogued Parliament to have the leadership race. That bill would have required that platforms disclose the nature of their algorithm and how it's influencing the discourse in our country, in our democracy. So absent of that, we need to come up with creative methods to figure that out. And you can sort of, like I mentioned that we saw this spike in amplification of conservative content. And you can do that by seeing how much is being posted versus how much is being seen and how much is being engaged with. And if you're getting a disproportionate effect of engagement on from the amount that's posted, you can assume that's being boosted by an algorithm. But again, it's kind of detective work, honestly. It's not a science.
And boosts on the algorithm, I mean, the last time we talked, artificial intelligence was still in the lab. Yeah. Is there going to be any way to determine whether or not if things are being boosted, that it's by humans and not machine?
Well, boosted. So there's algorithmic boosting. So there's
right. So bots.
You and I both being humans, we are not bots as far as I know. We both post a piece of content and we both have the same number of followers, let's say, hypothetically, although I'm sure you have many more than I do. Let's say you're degraded to my status on X. We both post and yours gets seen by 10 million people and mine gets seen by 1 million. We can assume that algorithm, for whatever reason, chose yours over mine, right? So that's one form of boosting.
Right. And that has been around for a while.
For sure, although it's getting much worse because our feeds are much more centralized than they used to be. That's a real change in the ecosystem from 2019, where what we saw was determined by our stated preferences, who we followed, what we liked. That would determine the kind of content we saw. Now it's much more behavioral based. So they're trying to get us to behave in a certain way when we see that content. And it turns out we all behave in pretty similar ways. So we're all seeing very similar content in our feeds now. They're highly centralized in a way they weren't before. So if you torque that algorithm to more conservatives or more liberals or more progressives or more harmful speech or more racist speech or whatever you're doing, right? That will affect a lot of people because the feeds are so centralized. But the other way the discourse can be manipulated or ideas can be boosted, maybe not individual accounts or content, is through automated accounts. And this is a real change as well. That there's been bots for a long time, but what's new is that there's bots that are combined with large language models, which means the bots can operate on their own. So it's very easy to purchase a large number of very cheap bots and then train them on a language model and just deploy them out onto X. And they just operate on their own, without direct human control. And with those kinds of campaigns, it doesn't matter that you're influencing, that one piece of content is reaching one person. It's that if you flood the zone with a particular set of ideas or type of content, you can shape the overall character of the debate. And we saw a lot of that in the last US election in the US, where you saw issues being raised that people, like the eating cats thing, right? Like that was something that just took on a life of its own, in part because it was just being manipulated by what they think were foreign governments in many cases, but also domestic actors wanting to boost that content. And a lot of it was done through automated bot accounts.
So this is a heightened weapon in the information war, the LLMs.
It is.
Now, have you seen any evidence of that being used against Canada, or is that mostly out of
No, we have.
In Ukraine, you have.
Yeah, we absolutely have. And already in this election, we're starting to see some of it. But the case that really got us onto this in Canada was the Kirkland Lake bot incident. I don't know if you remember that, but
yeah, I think Poilievre was up in Kirkland Lake making an announcement, right?
Yeah, so he was in Kirkland Lake, and that day, 1,000 or so, several thousand accounts all started congratulating him on the campaign event and the speech. And it looked kind of weird. Like, why was anybody at this? There's more people than were actually at this thing. And all of a sudden everyone's talking about it on X, and it got a bit of momentum and trended. And the Liberals blamed the Poilievre campaign for running a bot operation, and the Poilievre campaign blamed the Liberal campaign of running a false flag bot operation. And
it's the fog of war, isn't it? It's
absolutely fog of war.
Yeah.
But we looked at it, right? We studied it for over a month, and it turns out it's almost certainly a single individual trying out this combination of a small bot farm and LLMs. And he trained the bots on a news feed. And the day he hit go, or a person hit go, the first story was the Kirkland Lake story. So that's what it ran with.
Wow.
So it's just this, we think it was just most likely kind of a trial balloon of someone trying out this capacity. And it just happened to hit Kirkland Lake, and it just happened to get picked up by journalists and
what a tremendous success,
and it took on a life of its own.
Yeah. I mean, if who knows if it's some guy in his basement or some guy at the State Department in the US or someone in Russia.
Who knows? Yeah.
You don't know.
But it almost doesn't matter. Right? It almost doesn't matter. Right. Yeah. And it didn't work because it made anyone think Poilievre's a better campaigner, or it didn't matter about the message. In part, what's more worrying about it, even though it's kind of a trite example, is that it kind of made our debate more toxic. It made conservatives dislike liberals more because they think they did it. And it made liberals think Poilievre was doing something nefarious with a bot campaign. And it made journalists kind of have to cover this story. And it just degraded our discourse. And I think what we're really seeing in the US, they really are ahead of us in almost, there's sort of they're often on these trends a few years ahead of where we are. And that's, I think, ultimately what we saw there in the last election, and we see in the American discourse now, is not that it's particularly vulnerable to Russian interference or Chinese sock puppets or whatever it might be, but that the whole quality of the discourse is so degraded that nobody trusts anybody. Everyone dislikes everybody more than they ever have. And the overall, like the facts and truth, like you're talking about in the show, are less and less relevant to anything, politics included, public health.
Yeah, no, that's part of
whatever,
what motivates
the financial markets. It's all degraded because nobody believes anything anymore. And I sure hope we're not heading down that path.
Yeah, once you degrade information, you degrade everything. There's nothing bigger in a society than that. But yeah. We're experimenting with bots. We hope it's not bots for evil, but it's bots for good. And one of the things that we are going to apply to this ecosystem, as you've defined it, is machine intelligence around fact checking, because some of the research that we've seen is that, because people are so doubtful that humans can do this anymore, they are maybe even less doubtful about machines. They think machines are somehow incapable of the kind of bias that they believe humans have, even though machines have a different kind of bias, but they have their own. Do you have worries about that? I mean, we think about it and we wonder, like, what are we unleashing here if we let go of the human aspect of this? But is it time yet, do you think, to have a bot that introduces into the ecosystem the idea that facts exist?
In principle, no. It depends a bit on what it's doing and how it's trained. So I'd love to know, like, I'm curious about the plans here.
But we trained it. We took as much human intelligence as we had as sort of the ethical guidelines of journalism, the ethical guidelines of fact checking.
Yeah.
We prompted it with, research guidelines and tried to teach it to be less precise in wanting to please humans by providing an answer, and that no answer is a fine answer. So that's where we started.
Going out into the world and it's just sort of commenting on events as they happen?
No, it will.
Responding to
you will content? Have to, as a human, say, I'm not sure what is accurate in this piece and what isn't. And you'll have to
I see.
Cut and paste the URL into it, and then it'll tell you.
Oh, it's like a chatbot thing.
Yeah. This is verified. This is not verified. So that's our beginning concept anyway.
Yeah, look, I think it's a good example of, I think, how journalists and researchers are trying to, and civil society actors are trying to use these tools in ways that produce positive outcomes for democracies. And I think we should be experimenting a lot with this stuff. I'm not fully convinced that there's going to be technical solutions to some of these problems. I mean, I think the big platforms are trying to tell us that they can automate the solutions to this, and that generative AI is going to be the most reliable source of information in our society. And that AI tools are going to be able to clean up the ecosystem that is sort of, in many ways, by design, quite toxic at the moment. And I'm skeptical that that's the singular solution to this. But I do think we all need to be experimenting with them, because these are immensely powerful tools. They're being used for nefarious purposes, and they need to be used for positive ones too. So yeah, I applaud it. I would encourage studying its effect, though, and would love to be a part of helping that if there's an opportunity, because I think these are important experiments, and I think journalists using it too are like a lot of journalists, and there's a big debate, as you know, about should newsrooms be using these tools and how, and there's a lot of incentives from the AI companies for them to do so as well. And I worry when we take our first step is to take humans out of the loop. And we need to ensure, I think, that we're ensuring human content and
encouraging
encouraging it as much as we can in the presence of this pressure we're on and incentives that are going the other way right now.
Well, there's always wise words of caution, and by all means, we will share whatever we learn, and I'll send you an account. Listen, I'll subscribe to your podcast if you subscribe to my bot.
And your podcast. No, it's a deal. Two
That's
for
awesome. One. That's awesome. Listen, thank you so much, Taylor. This has been great as always. I always learn so much from you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Let's do it again soon.
All right. Cheers. Well, there you have it. Our first edition of the Get Fact podcast. Our music is composed by Nicholas Webster. A huge thank you to Startwell Studios here in Toronto, who provided this space for us to get started. There are many other ways that you can engage in fact-checking on our brand new website, getfact.ca. We are an all-volunteer organization, so if you have it within your means to provide a small donation, we'd appreciate it. I'm Kevin Newman.